Good evening, everybody. Honored guests, distinguished panel. It's such a dream come true to be here. It's so exciting. And I'm going to be your governor for the next half an hour. This is Syed Zakir Hussain. He's going to be our deputy governor for monetary policy. And we have our faculty advisor, Dr. V. Mohan Kumar. So let's get started. Go ahead.
So good evening. Myself Syed Zakir Hussain. We are from School of Management Studies, Hyderabad. Is it working? Okay. Given scenario is oil prices rises to $70 a barrel due to trouble in the Middle East, and Fed funds rate expected to rise to 1% by year due to inflation pressure. Other existing factors as of March 2016 being unchanged. Monetary policies and liquidity measures based on the current and evolving macroeconomic situations. Repo rate stands at 6.75 and CRR at 4%. Monetary policy and liquidity. The overnight repo rates at 0.25% and long term for 14 days at 0.75% only. Reverse repo rate consecutively unchanged at 5.75% and bank rate at 7.75%. Increased liquidity provided under the export credit financial facility changes from accommodative stance to a neutral stance. Assessments. Since the 6th bi-monthly statement of December 2015, we have seen the following. Gradual projection in the global activity, 3.1% in 2015, 3.4% in 2016, and 3.62 in 2017. Downside risk recovery of AEs prevailing in January 2016 has eased, and EMEs continue with weak growth and elevated inflation. Manufacturing activity sluggish, improving labor market in the Euro, improving labor market in the US supporting a consumption-led recovery, manufacturing activities sluggish, refractory retrenchment in oil and gas drilling activity, and declining exports. In Japan, again, domestic demands continue to be low. In China, growth slow because of manufacturing, residential investment, and exports. Normalization of US monetary policy was fully anticipated along with an increase in Fed rate by 0.5% to 1%. Crude oil prices increased to $70 a barrel due to trouble in the Middle East. Developing economic with an expected GDP growth of 7%. This is very good for us. And one more feather in our cap is we have replaced China as the fastest growing major economy in 2014.
So let's continue looking at the economic situation right now. We have our GVA, which is poised to increase at 7.8%, most of which is coming from the services sector. The domestic assessment is again, we're hoping to have a normal monsoon this year, and the lead indicators of the services sector are still mixed. Construction activity is still tepid. The liquidity conditions are tightened in the second half of December with advanced tax outflows. We have the government spending, which is a little restrained, and India's exports remain in the contraction mode. So we need to work on that, and the oil prices will not help with this. And the net FDI and the non-resident deposits have remained robust in relation to the last year. And so this is like a quick overall look at our economy. So we see that our bases are quite strong, our fundamentals are still quite strong. And so using that, we're moving forward to our policy stance and rationale behind it. So considering the unrest in Middle East, the accommodative stance will be changed to a neutral stance while keeping a very close eye on the developments. The inflation has evolved closely along the trajectory set by the monetary policy stance. But then the implementation of our Central Pay Commission is still not factored into the projections, which we will do so once it's appropriate to do so. And we look at more prospects of agriculture and industrial activities. And our unemployment rate and our inflation rate are still in places where we want to go to. A quick look at our key indicators. And so our economy is moving in the direction we want it to. Things are looking good. Our bases are quite strong. And our Indian consumer confidence. So our consumer confidence index is at 131. It is very, very optimistic. People are very optimistic about what is going to happen for us in the coming future. And so our policy stance is that we have everything that we need for a stable and sustainable growth. And so we've changed it to neutral while waiting for further developments on inflation based on the oil price changes. And we will be looking at the structural reforms from the monetary and the fiscal policies as well. Our inflation, again, so far it's on track, and the CPI inflation is 5.4, stabilized for about 5 to 10 years. We have a look at the Chinese and US inflation rates as well. Our standard of living index, which looks at the basic human needs, foundations of well-being, the opportunities available, it's still ranked at 113th. It gives us an idea about what we need to work towards. And this is a quick look at the effect of oil prices on the world GDP. The pink line is the world GDP, our blue line is the oil prices. So we have seen very sharp increases and fall in our oil prices. And the world GDP also has increased and fallen, but not as much. It's still pretty stable. And so oil prices was at 35.570. It's jumped significantly, about 50%. And there's again a quick look at our world growth in GDP, energy, and oil. So they all kind of move close together. And again, a quick look at our global GDP versus the annual oil price changes. We have seen it moving in tandem. And we have a projection oil consumption. Our oil consumption is much lesser than the consumption of China and US, and the percentage of growth is also much lesser. So this is a look at the projection of the federal funds rate. So it has been low from 2010 onwards, and we expect it to be low, but we've been given enough warnings that it is going to be increased. This is our CPI month on month with a year on year, and we're on target for that. And so again, a quick look at our policy stance and rationale behind it. So we see that our inflation rate is on target. Things are going well. We see that we have to maintain our objective of our inflation target. We need the fact that we moved to a neutral stance indicates to our country that we will be keeping a close eye on everything. The federal Fed rate, which is going to be increased, is also, it's not a surprise. These are global risks that we have kept things in mind, and it has been factored into our basis so far. And we also want to coordinate with the government on translating of measures into results. So our subsidies need to be looked at based on the new oil prices. We need to work hand in hand. So again, we need to monitor oil prices, US interest rates, take interim measures as needed, and we will be coming up with another monetary policy quite soon. So that is it for now.
Thank you very much, Madam Governor. Or should it be governess? No, Governor. You know, as the first Lady Governor of the Reserve Bank, I'd love to ask you how it feels to be announcing monetary policy. And given that this is the last bastion which women have to traverse in this country, of course, there's still Chief of Army Staff also.
It was just a matter of time, sir. So it had to happen.
Thank you. Let me ask Deputy Governor Khan if he has a question.
Governor Bina, it's nice hearing you talked about global crisis and oil crisis problems coming out of oil. But you didn't mention anything to be done other than the monetary policy in terms of external sector. So what is your sense, how do we manage our external sector, because that has a huge impact in the economy. And number 2 question, now that all Reserve Bank top management is below 25, we have go back to the old this issue of inflation versus growth. I think, would you like to think that we should make this flexible inflation targeting little more flexible and add growth that to that? Now the younger aspirational class is looking for growth rather than inflation. Yeah.
To your first part, you talked about the external sector. Do you have something? So for the external sector, sir, I think the fact that the oil prices are increasing with our economy doing well, it's we would, I still think, leave the supply and demand to take its course and wait for the invisible hand of prices to help out. Sometimes it is okay to just sit back and watch what's happening. And sorry, could you repeat your second part of the question?
Now that we have a young Reserve Bank top executives, would you like to reorient or recalibrate the flexible inflation targeting to bring in a little bit of growth, maybe anchoring nominal GDP as your target?
Not at all, not at all. Because our economic growth right now is it's going on target, and only when inflation is controlled will we see the hand-in-hand growth of inflation and the economic growth. So we have to not change our stance. I think keeping that in mind, it is in the best interests of the young on the way things are going. So I would say definitely keep that in mind.
Thank you,
keep that
100% for that answer. He was trying to get you to comment on current policy. Let me give it to Professor Ashima Goyal and then Pranjul Bhandari after that.
Thank you. You have been faced with a large shock, rise in oil prices. When oil prices fell steeply, it was expected to spur global demand, but it led to a recession. Have you thought about that and therefore its impact on the current rise? What are the expectations from that? The second question was that you've been faced by a large number, 2 shocks, major shocks, but you've chosen not to change anything in policy, except you switched to a neutral stance. So do you distinguish between how persistent shocks are? How do you decide when you need to change policy parameters, when you can choose to wait?
Let me go that in reverse. First of all, in all our policies, we have a lot of global risks which are factored in. We cannot look at every single thing happening in every country. So there is a certain amount of global risks which is always factored in. And the rise or fall in oil prices, we've seen, and especially the developing nations, it does not spur a huge demand. We have seen that in the past. So, but it, so I think that calling this a huge risk is not very appropriate, especially with the Fed rates. We have been anticipating it for a while, and it does mean that economic growth is going the way the US economy wants it to. It means that the inflation is rising a little bit, which I think is a good thing for the US right now. And so considering that the Fed interest rate rise is not a shock, it is not a risk. I think it was something we anticipated. So that's not, I don't think we need to factor it as a huge risk. And the second part of the oil prices increasing, it could be a temporary situation, just trouble in the Middle East increasing by 50%. Is not something we've not seen before. These are things we've seen before. These are things that have been factored into the market. So I don't think it's a huge risk, and a knee-jerk reaction is not needed for the way we're poised. I think things are looking good, they're going good, and just closely monitoring it is, I think, is fair enough. And so I don't think it's fair even calling them two huge risks. So they're just things that are happening around, and we know how to deal with them. Can Zakir would like to add something?
Rising to $70 is not a shock, because already the prices are too high and the taxation are too high. With the present rate, the government is earning about 60% of profit. So the profit is with the industries and government. Let them be bear this shock instead of common man.
Pranjul?
Yeah, so I'm proud to be in a country where a wonderful lady like you is the governor. You know, you seem very comfortable with GDP growth. You know, you said we are doing pretty well. You know, the youth should be happy with this number and so on. But until 2011, the GDP data that we had, which was the old GDP series, that was showing that GDP is growing at 5.5%. Overnight, we were told that, hey, it was not 5.5, it was actually 7%. So are you really happy with that? Do you really buy it? Do you actually question it? And do you look for other, you know, measures of growth to compensate for the fact that we've sort of moved to this new series at this point? And my second question is on inflation. Again, you're very comfortable that, you know, we've been meeting our targets, but this is not the end of it. We have another big target coming up when we move to 4%, you know, as the midpoint of the band in the next couple of years. How do you plan to sort of get there? Have you done some thinking about it?
So the change from the GDP to GVA was a decision which was taken by the government, and the GVA is a measure of the true value add, the true profits of what is happening. And I think it reflects more of what's happening in the service sector, where the margins are higher. So I think those have been taken into account in the GVA, which was probably slightly lesser with the GDP. So right now, these are the numbers we've been given. So these are the numbers we're working with. And 7% is quite a decent number to work with. So, and the way things are looking, it is a good number to keep at, to continue at. So I think that is fine so far. And so the inflation target you mentioned, again, we have set a target. We've been working towards it. And so taking things step by step is a good thing. You know, it's always like it's like a range of being between dissatisfied and not satisfied. So you know, once we reach here, we have something more to do. You know, we're not going to sit back in our laurels. It's never going to work that way. So for our inflation target, again, we know where we're going. We know how we're going. But it's okay to have our interim goals in between and say, yes, we have reached it. Now let's look further and, you know, go ahead. So I think it's fine to look at the inflation target that way and be happy with where we're going and where we are. So at this moment.
Sandrine?
Hello, from the press here. You mentioned you would be ready to take interim measures as needed. Does that imply you would be ready to raise rates in between scheduled meetings? And is it a kind of practice you're comfortable with?
I would have to wait and see what happens with the trouble in Middle East before I can answer that question, because I don't want to give any hypothetical situation and cause any undue scares. So, so we're just going to watch it closely and see how it goes and make sure that we stay on target.
Can you clarify by what you meant by interim measures then?
That's exactly what I meant. So we will keep an eye and we will decide as needed. So,
Which means you will take action. You may take action.
Yeah.
Which means you may take action.
that's, yes, we may take action.
Well, Governor Beena, you must realize we in the press will harp on a point till
we love you for
till we
it.
get the headline we want. So I'm going to press on Sandrine's point and say, you've moved from accommodative to neutral at this point. What we want to see is a rationale and an assessment of policy outlook, which is what we flip to very fast in the policy document as soon as we see it. What is the policy outlook? Are you more inclined to move from neutral to hiking and a tighter monetary policy, or neutral to back towards accommodative? Because that's what the market looks for in a crisis, is stability from the central bank.
Right now, we are staying at neutral. Given all the economic indicators, looking at the scenario, getting a feel from all the political forces from around the world, we have decided to stay at neutral, and that's where we will stay until we get further information.
Even if there's a risk of capital outflows, even with the risk of capital outflows at this point?
The capital outflows, especially with the Fed interest rate, is something that will happen. But with the exchange rate change and all that, we really need to see the real picture before we decide on anything.
Thank you very much, Governor, for that. You certainly show a knack in handling the press as well as difficult questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.